Welcome to Real World, Real Talk with Dr. D.Z. Cofield. This show represents captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. D.Z. Cofield.
Welcome to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, and I want to welcome you to this edition that promises to be a very exciting show as we begin to delve into some of the in-depth conversations that are being had around the country. And one of the conversations that we're having, especially around the issue of race, criminal injustice, and what we are going to do to combat it is specifically around the church. What is going to be the church's position on race and faith? And one of the amazing things that we're seeing is a coalescing going on, not wide range, not the majority, but I think a really good group of believers, those who say they are Christ followers across racial and ethnic lines, who are coming together to basically say enough is enough. That if we're going to be people of faith, that faith needs to show up in our walk and in our talk. It has to be more than just Sunday morning. I think without question, the Black church has been in the forefront of civil rights work for decades, for generations. But we're seeing now white evangelicals who are stepping up, I think, arguably in record numbers, who are asking some tough questions, who are looking in the mirror saying, what can I do to be part of the solution and not just passively sit on the sideline and, in essence, be part of the problem. And so I've got two guests on with us on tonight that are going to be able to give us some insight into what's going on and an upcoming event on tomorrow night, October the 12th, that you don't want to miss. Now, just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. If you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on Instagram, on Facebook, and on Twitter at DZ Cofield. You can also follow me on all social media handles at RWRTDZ. That's RWRTDZ at any social media handle. I'm excited to have back with us on our show today, one who is a guest, one who has been a frequent guest with us, and that's none other than Joel Goza. He's author of the book, America's Unholy Ghost. It's a book that I've been recommending to friends and enemies alike. And everybody who has read the book has been moved to a response, has been moved to think, has been challenged to think about the racist roots of their faith and their politics and how those politics play out. And I've got to tell you, I've literally been praying for Joel because I told him, based on the book, and he's calling out names and putting pictures in there just in case you wondered who he was talking about. I'm like, brother, I'm praying that the Holy Spirit protect you and guide you. I'm also happy to have with us on tonight a brother that I have tremendous respect for, known him for several years. And this has been the first opportunity that we've had to work very closely, extensively together. And that's Dr. Michael Emerson. He is the professor and department head of sociology at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He is the author of 15 books. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he was at Rice University and was part of the team that worked around the Kinder Institute. And tremendously insightful brother, a person who I would say throws fastballs and throws them right down the center of the plate and doesn't veer to the left or to the right. And I appreciate so much, both of these brothers. Let's welcome them both to Real World, Real Talk. Joel Goza and Michael Emerson, thank you for being with us on tonight. And man, I appreciate you both being with me.
Delighted to be here for sure.
Yeah, very, very honored.
Yeah,
very honored.
I appreciate you all. So let me start with you, Joel, because you were the first one that contacted me. And let me just give everybody a little context before we talk about the event that's coming up on tomorrow night. When we saw the murder of George Floyd play out, and then subsequent to that, the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, you were moved in a way that I'd like for you to share with our listening audience, because, you know, you're a brother who has been very public in your position and your belief when it comes to racism being at the root of both our faith and our politics, and the role that the white church has played, both intentionally and unintentionally, consciously and subconsciously, and maybe unconsciously, around perpetuating many of the myths that undergird the behaviors that we're seeing in politics and we're seeing in law enforcement. But you were moved. Talk about that feeling that you had as you saw those things play out.
Yeah, you know, it was those eerie moments where you're watching history be played out in real time. And the background of where I was coming from was that I am currently working on a book on reparations. And I'm writing a lot about the lynching era. And one of the things that I write about is how during every racial era in America, whether it was slavery, segregation with its lynchings, or the colorblind age that promoted racialized poverty and incarceration rates, behind each of those inequalities, there were always racial lies. And what, I'd been reading Ida B. Wells, who was probably America's foremost fighter against lynching. And one of the things that Ida B. Wells writes about is how what made lynchings possible were pulpits and the press. And what she said is that either pulpits would support the lies or they would stay silent within these lies. And so when we saw the murders happening in the street, we were watching what Ida B. Wells was writing about 100 years ago play out in real time. That the reason that African Americans continue to get killed by cops is because we've lied to ourselves about our racial politics. We have supported, we being kind of white Christians, have supported a president who continually lies about African Americans, lies about African American violence. And he does that in order to be able to justify when cops kill people like Breonna Taylor or George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery. And the only reason that he can lie is for some reason Christians have not found the courage to be as specific enough and hold him accountable when he is doing these things that are ripping apart our country. And so we find ourselves living in this place where it is the broken records and the wheels on the bus just go round and round, round and round. And the people that are always getting rolled over are African Americans, their families, and their communities.
Yeah. Michael Emerson, you've been writing a lot longer than Joel, and you have been sounding this alarm for many years in terms of just challenging the church, and in particular challenging the white church to really step up. Let me ask you how you felt, because you and I never really talked about just your feelings as you saw this unfold, and then what you see playing out now.
I remember I was upstairs. Someone was downstairs where our television was on, and they said there's just been a shooting or a murder, they said, in Minneapolis, and it isn't going to be good. Came downstairs, and I remember thinking, this is going to be it, because the video was so clear and exposing what is often said actually exists, but there it was. And I've been saying for a few years, the level of racial inequality we have, we will not be able to avoid exploding. I mean, that's what happens when we allow such inequalities, such deep, deep disparities in how we experience life and the opportunities we get. And here we are in the day of reckoning.
Yeah. No, absolutely. What do you see as the biggest challenge for the church? Because you've been challenging the church in general, I think Christians in particular, and white Christians specifically, to make some choices, to take some stances. What do you see as the greatest challenge that the white church is facing right now?
Okay, so I'm going to just jump in and be controversial. So it's been the last couple of years. Wrote a book called Divided by Faith 20 years ago. Spent the last couple of years seeing, has anything changed in 20 years? And finding over and over in all our measures and studies, not only hasn't it changed, but in many measures, it's actually gotten worse, the divide between black and white Christian. So I'm actually building off of Joel's book and several others, making an argument in a new book with a colleague named Glenn Bracey at Villanova. But this is how we finally, to me, make sense of everything that's happened in our history and make sense of what's happening now. White Christianity isn't Christianity. What it is what I call the religion of whiteness. That the worship that's been passed, the faith that has been sent here from Europe through many things that Joel writes about, those are the very roots of it. It isn't Christianity. It isn't even vaguely a form of Christianity. It is truly the worship of whiteness. And I know I'm just jumping in and how can I say such a thing? But we devised some experiments in which we let white Christians choose between whiteness and authentic biblical Christianity. And overwhelmingly, every time they chose whiteness when they had to make a choice.
Wow. That's it. Yeah. You jumped in. We're in the deep end right now. No. That's wow. So I've got to tell you, that statement is so man, what's the word for me? That statement is so powerful, because for many years, having been part of and having gone to white evangelical institutions, I always left struggling with how some of my white brothers and sisters, and I'll use quotation marks around that, who say they love the same Jesus I love, could be so diametrically opposed to what I see as the basic tenets of faith. I mean, just, kind of like, hey, man, this is what Jesus says, like, love ye one another. Like, you don't have to, be a Greek exegete to figure that one out, man. I mean, the challenge is not understanding it, but putting it in practice, and just the disconnect that I see between how they treat people, this embracing of capitalism and all of the downside of capitalism. I mean, this insatiable greed that we see, and the justification of it in the name of Jesus, it's just unbelievable. And whenever you hear, other terms used, they use in very disparaging ways, even though these are people who love Jesus by evidence of how they live and how they treat other people. But it's like, no, they're discounted. Their faith doesn't matter. What have you concluded is the justification for this embracing of whiteness over this embracing of Christianity?
Well, I think Joel goes into, in his book on Holy Ghost, right, the three religious lies and the three political lies that were given to the beginning of this country by European philosophers. Was it Locke, Hobbes, and Smith, right? And they able to convince the religious world, the white religious world, that you can construct a Christianity that doesn't care about the oppressed, doesn't care about the broken, that you can see. Well, I should let Joel talk. You want to mention what the three are, Joel, and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, sure. So the three religious lies that I write about was that you could know, the first lie was that you could know the God of the broken and the abused without needing to know the broken and the abused. So we have a God who in the Christian tradition we refer to as Father. One of the ideas within white Christianity is that you can know God without knowing all of his children, which is a really interesting thing. But basically the idea is that earthly relationships become secondary and religious knowledge itself, religious formulas become primary. The second lie that I write about is that religion gets reduced to soul salvation, so that all religion is about saving my soul and getting me to heaven. And then the final lie is that indifference to injustice is no threat to one's intimacy with God. And so when you read scripture, what becomes clear is that the Christian life is painted as this participatory exercise. Well, what ends up happening within Western Christianity is that it gets simply reduced to this conversion experience. And no longer am I, as a Christian, a participant with God in the redemption of the world, like Paul would write about, or the early church would believe. Now I know that I'm on the right side of the equation. And so what happens from here on out is really no threat to my relationship with God. And what ends up happening on American soils is that we design a religious war. But the very design of the war that raged on American soils made civilian casualty look like war criminals. And so it was always the African Americans that we painted as the problem. These were the folks who were criminal. And so when you see them suffer, it's actually just a system working like it's supposed to do, because of the different sins from African American communities, African American individuals. And it becomes very difficult for white people like myself to really understand the type of game that is being played. Because we've been taught all the wrong rules to understand it. And so we think in terms of checkers instead of thinking in terms of chess with how this thing's going.
Yeah. So it's interesting because in your scenario, which I think is spot on, it's not only I don't need to have a relationship with the broken, but I justify creating the broken and perpetuating the broken. And I can do it in the name of the Lord and not be convicted by the very God that I say I serve and I love.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the event tomorrow night, because I think it's a fascinating event, and it's something, Joel, that you and Mike have been working on. For our listening audience, we've been having discussions in multiple camps and circles with white pastors and between white pastors and black pastors. Part of the reason that I have been committed to this process is because I don't believe that racism can ever be fully addressed in this country until we call racism what it is, and that's sin. And the ones who we know it's sin, biblical believers know it's sin, black Christians know it's sin, but it's amazing that many white Christians don't seem to know it's sin or want to call it sin. And then because it is never called sin, it is never fought against or addressed in that way. And so I've been meeting with and talking to white pastors and church leaders. And I think I will say this, I'm 58. I have been more encouraged in these conversations than I ever have been in the past, because I had virtually given up on the white church and basically said, you know what it is. But there have been some white pastors who have really just stepped up and said, you know what, this is wrong. And for those who are listening, they've paid the price. They've lost, some of these pastors have lost their churches. Some have lost hundreds of members. Some have lost millions of dollars in their budget, because there are people who, in the name of God, have embraced bigotry instead of embracing biblical truths, and have affirmed what they have always believed and what they have been taught, even if it's wrong, rather than saying, you know what, maybe I need to look at this and prayerfully ask God to show me some things about me that I need to change. And so this event was given birth to, and Joel, I want you to share what what was the impetus behind this event and what the event is?
Well, I think one of the great blessings that Michael and I have had in our lives are pastors like you who have really spoken into it and have provided a different type of wisdom. And so both Michael and I are, very, very white, but we've been embraced by different Black church communities and have been mentored and raised up to different understandings than what we previously held. And so as the election was approaching, both of us felt that we saw a train wreck coming. And the question that we were wrestling with was what little bit could we do from our end to participate in this election? And, when 2016 happened, the responsibility that I took was to vote. And what became clear to me is that that's no longer sufficient. And so the best thing that we knew to do was to get together with people we respected. And we got our first two draft choices. We wanted you and Kevin Cosby from Louisville, and just to pass the mic off and to create an environment where white Christians from across partisan divides can come in and listen and be challenged. And, when what becomes obvious is that this is much deeper than a Republican problem. And so we wanted to create an environment where we dealt explicitly with this election coming up and see how we can stand in solidarity with the community of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor during this moment. And just learn from the pastors who have been ministering in these communities all along.
I want to say, one, Joel, and I want to make sure our listening audience understands that you were not saying not to vote. You have voted, but that we need to do more than just vote. Just
more than just voting. Right. Yeah. And so, when I vote, that brings one vote.
Right.
But if I can bring some other folks to the polling booth, and if I can do that, then I can increase my participation in our democracy. And that's what I felt very responsible in doing.
Well, and I think, and let me also say this for those who may be listening, this is, as you know, not just for the record, but in actuality, we're nonpartisan. We're not promoting any specific party. And what I wanted to bring to light that I'd like for you to comment on, Michael, is this idea that all of us who are people of faith, and it doesn't matter. I think I can speak for other faith groups, whether you are Islamic or you are Jewish, that other faith communities, the challenge that we have in this country is to stop as believers looking at what goes on around us through the lens of politics, and to look at this world and look at our society through the lens of our faith. Like, can we stop really making, in essence, our politics our God and our religion? That's been a challenge for me, Mike, and I'd like for you to speak to that if you would, because to me that I've been so disappointed to hear Christians who have wholeheartedly and boldly supported somebody who is an admitted liar, admitted xenophobe, admitted, take advantage of women and treat them, as less than. I mean, just all of those things that we would say are not biblical, and turn around and just kind of turn a blind eye to that, when those things should be the tenets of our faith. When you wouldn't want your daughter dating somebody like this, you wouldn't want your daughter bringing home somebody who uses locker room language and all of those kinds of things, and it's okay. And again, I think in some ways as Christians, because I don't think either party represents in totality who God is and the breadth of God's love. So either way, I feel like as a believer, I go into the ballot box holding my nose. I mean, if I'm gonna vote, I got to choose, but I'm gonna hold my nose either way. But just this inability of believers to say, you know what, even though I may not agree with this or this is wrong, I'm still going to vote. But let's stop calling it right. Let's stop pretending like it's not wrong, like it is wrong, and just say, you know what, I'm going to vote for this guy, even though I think he's wrong. But I'm not going to try to justify his wrong. I don't know. Help me with that.
Two things. One, of course, if you go back to understanding the religion of whiteness, then it all makes sense. So someone like our current president really represents those issues very well and speaks to them and speaks against those who would resist kind of the dominance of white America. So partly that's how I make sense of it. The other is, if you think about where we're at in terms of this current election's coming, I agree with you totally. We only get two choices. Other countries get lots of choices. We're in a tough spot that way. We did a survey very recently, just within the last month and a half, and we asked people, Christians, where do you get your news? Where do you get your information by which you make your decisions about what's right and wrong, all that? And the number one answer wasn't the church or anything like that. The number one answer was television news. So then we also asked, which news source do you most trust? And for white Christians, by far, I mean, nothing else come close. You know what I'm going to say. It's Fox News. So the last month or so, we've been watching and analyzing what is taught, what is said on Fox News on the most watched shows in the evening. And I'll give you one example. So this happened on September 2nd on the Tucker Carlson show, which is currently the most watched cable news show in the country. It was about, it started by showing a Catholic church in New York, and they gave a prayer. And what they were praying, it was a responsive prayer, confessing the sin of white dominance, of white superiority, of white privilege. And then they were asking the congregation to say yes to that we have harmed our fellows, that we all suffer from it, and so on. And then it came back to Tucker Carlson. He goes, wow, that's 2020 in 20 seconds. The left has won. They have killed God. They have killed religion. We are now social justice warriors. And then he has a guest come on, and the guest says, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically, if you support social justice, if you support a movement of Black Lives Matters and so on, you are Marxists, and Marxists hate God, and hating God is the destruction of the church. So if you let that kind of stuff come into your church, that is the death of the American church. And I appeal to every pastor in this country, don't destroy the church. So that's where the learning happens. What is my faith? What is my religion? That's what it is.
Well, and I think to your point, when I make that shift and my religion is not the Christianity of the Bible, but my religion is whiteness, even though Tucker Carlson would never just come out and say, no. I am promoting the church of whiteness and the religion of whiteness. Clearly, as you start tracing that argument and you start dismantling it, it becomes a straw man, really, really quickly if you just on a cursory level read the Bible and just, start asking some really basic questions. It doesn't hold water. 2020, a look at race, faith, and politics. What do you hope to see accomplished in this discussion on tomorrow, Joel?
Well, the thing that I have always wondered is what could happen to our nation if white Christians would actually take the time to learn from African American Christians about how to view race, faith, and politics. From Michael's research and other research, one of the things, that we have learned is that the religions that have the most in common in America today are Black Protestantism and white evangelicalism. And yet if you look at who votes the most differently, it is Black Protestants and white evangelicals, because the racial dynamics go so deeply within white evangelicalism. And I've always wondered what would happen if even a small minority of white evangelicals would take the time and learn from the tradition that shaped Dr. King. What would that do to our nation? What would that do to the Republican Party? What would that do to the Democratic Party? I really think that if we learned from Dr. King and the revolution that he tried to begin 40, 50 years ago, that our nation could be in a fundamentally different place. And one of the things that King always had hoped for was that white Christians would join him in his struggle. And yet, rather than joining King in his struggle, what ended up happening is political alliances formed to create movements that ran in the entirely different direction. Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority. And so what I'm hoping from our time on Monday is just an experiment in listening and allowing people to receive a wisdom that has the depth perception to understand how politics and race and religion touch ground and impact communities and families and people across America.
Wow, that's yeah. I think it's going to be very, very, very powerful. Mike, what do you hope comes out of this discussion?
What I love about the format is that you and Reverend Dr. Cosby get the mic and the voice, and the rest of us get to listen, get to think about questions we might want to ask, but we don't get to control what happens. We get to learn from each of your wisdom. And I think that's a format that's just way too rare, just as Joel was mentioning. So I'm so excited that you're willing to do this, and really hope your listeners will join in.
Why is that important, Mike, in your mind?
If you're married, what do we always say? The number one thing is communication. If we're fellow believers, we're married, like it or not. And we've got to communicate, but the communication is so overwhelmingly one way. We have to reverse that. And this is one small opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I think, I'm encouraged. One of the things that has been my mantra as I've met with groups and met with white pastors in particular is just to challenge them. One, is racism a sin? Can we agree on that? Because if we can't agree on that, then we really don't need to talk any further in terms of just how I perceive somebody. I don't even come at it from a supremacy perspective, because what I've discovered is that nobody wants to admit that they think they're better than somebody else, because that attitude is unchristian, even though I don't condemn the actions as unchristian, right? And so if you ask me, I'm like, no, of course not. I don't believe that, that I think I'm better than anybody else, even though by our actions we do. And then the second thing is if I think racism is a sin, am I willing to be an anti-racist? Am I willing to actively fight against it? And that becomes a place where I've discovered that a lot of white Christians are really challenged and now really have to look in the mirror, right? Mm. That I can't just passively sit back and say, yeah, I'm a Christ follower, but I don't see justice and my faith as inextricably tied together. That somehow I see this justice movement as something separate from that. Joel?
Right. Yeah. You could tell I was itching because one of the things when I was growing up is that I might have said that racism is a sin, but what I probably wouldn't admit is that racial inequality comes from racism. And part of the framing that is going on today of how essential it is that we be anti-racist is that it commits us to fighting against racial inequality. For so long, we've been able to divide at least people who think like I have thought and grew up the way that I have that I grew up, we had been able to divide in our minds racial inequalities as if these were some type of accidents from the sin of racism. And part of, I think, what we're hoping for on Monday night is that for those who join us, that can no longer be possible. Yeah.
What do you see as the challenge to this next generation?
The challenge is to finish what has been started and has been going on for a long time, right? The struggle. I use this analogy. If you think about when they were trying to break the sound barrier with flights, the pilots what they would encounter as they approach the sound barrier is that their planes would start shaking violently. And that violent shaking made it feel like, and possibly very much could make the plane explode. So they would pull back and not be able to cross that sound barrier. Finally, we had someone named Chuck Yeager who, either because he was crazy or very brave, decided, I don't care if this plane blows up, I'm going to puncture through that sound barrier. So as he approaches it, the plane shakes violently, but he just keeps going. And he truly punctures through it. And what does he find on the other side? A reality that nobody knew existed. Peaceful, serene, wonderful quietness. I mean, he's going faster than any human's ever gone in an airplane, and yet it's smoother than any ride has ever been. That's where we're at. We are in the shakes right now, and this country just keeps pulling back. So I wish for us to keep pushing so that our grandchildren can finally puncture through.
Wow. That's a great analogy. I mean, that I think not only will preach, Mike, but I think that's a great analogy, across the board. I mean, you think about when the earth was flat, and people kept on sailing, and they found out that it wasn't flat. It was actually round, and you weren't going to fall off, the edge of the planet. I mean, I remember before Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, there were scientists who were saying it was a physiological impossibility for a human being to run less than a 4-minute mile. I mean, just, hundreds of people had tried, thousands of people had tried, it never happened. And then when Bannister broke it, all of a sudden now, because the possibility is there, now you have tens of hundreds of people who broke the 4-minute mile immediately after him. And now, you're not even considered world class if you haven't broken a 4-minute mile. And so, yeah, no, that's absolutely tremendous. Joel, what are you thinking, and what are you saying as you think about this next generation, your own children and others?
Yeah. So when I think about the next generation and what my children need to have a future where we can all thrive, is I'm convinced that it's going to take all generations fighting today. That part of my children's future is still in my mom's hands, and that my mom and her generation are still shaping the future that our children have. And I think that what the challenge before us that I've been thinking a lot about is I've been thinking a lot about Emmett Till and his mother, and how his mother demands an open casket for his funeral. And I think part of the challenge for white people and for people fighting for anti-racism, across racial lines, is opening the casket of the victims of white supremacy and really looking inside and demanding that casket stays open. As white people, we have wanted to stop talking about our real history before we've ever even had the conversation. We wanted to deal with what was going on today. But for us to be able to really fight and understand what is going on today, we must deal with that history and the victims and really look inside these caskets. Because the truth of the matter is that people don't change until not changing becomes more painful than changing, until it's more scary to not push through that sound barrier than it is to go ahead and push through. And if we can keep the caskets of the victims of white supremacy open and really look inside and find the courage to really wrestle with what is going on here, we can paint a very, very different future for our children than the world as we have experienced it in our lifetimes.
What I think is amazing, because you both give very, very graphic images to help us think through how do we face the ugliness and how do we press through it, and the responsibility that we have to do that and the courage that it's going to take. And, I think, Michael Emerson, you have helped me today, because I think the mistake that I have made over the years is that I have expected white Christians to respond like Jesus, when in actuality, they're really not practicing the religion of Christianity. And if they're practicing the religion of whiteness, then even the faith of Jesus and being a Christ follower is antithetical to the religion of whiteness. And whether it's the religion of whiteness, or for some other groups, the religion of blackness, whatever it is, when you take that position of race or gender and you lift that above the teachings for those of us who are Christ followers, the teachings of Jesus, then it's easy for people to hold on to their positions and justify their positions, even if they're doing it with a cross around their neck, because in actuality, they're really not practicing Christianity. Joel, what would you like to say as we get ready to close out this segment to our audience about coming tomorrow to participate in and watch this event, Election 2020, Race, Faith, and Politics?
One of the interesting things that King said that was the greatest mistake of his ministry was in thinking that white Christians would join him in his struggle. And he said what he had to learn was that white Christians were more white than they were Christian. And yet he stayed vulnerable and he loved people right where they were. And I think part of what my story is that I was transformed by people loving me where I was at, and teaching me to see the world in a new way, in a new light. And my prayer is, for white people like myself to open themselves up to that love tomorrow night, to be able to learn to read their world very differently, and let their world shake because of the power of that love, so that the scales can fall off of our eyes and we can begin fighting for a very different future for our children. That is my hope.
Wow. Dr. Michael Emerson, what is your hope?
My hope and my prayer is really for mass conversion to authentic biblical Christianity. And this is such an important start. When we make that conversion, it is automatic that we see that God hurts deeply, weeps, and cares about justice, cares about reconciliation, cares about the least of these. I mean, that is the message. And when we can actually do that together, as opposed to fighting each other as we always have, we are going to see the kingdom of God ushered in a powerful way.
Well, one of the things I'm looking forward to hearing from you all and talking about is, how does the white church survive this? Because this is I think, a growing schism / chasm. It's interesting because, Black churches historically have split, but typically over personality, not over doctrine, right? White churches will split over doctrine. And it's going to be interesting. I'm wondering if this position around race and white supremacy becomes a dividing factor among churches, not unlike same-sex marriage or women in ministry. Does this become a dividing line for people to say, hey, if you're a Christian, and you really believe the tenets of Jesus, you ought to hold to this, and can we coexist because we're not going to be quiet anymore. Can we still coexist, or will that become a line of demarcation? It'll be very interesting to see. Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate both of you, man, being with me. Thank you so much for today. I want to say to our audience, thank you for listening. We'll be back in just a moment as I bring another guest in to talk about the issue of voter suppression and what it's going to mean for us in this election to make sure that we take a stand and make sure that we not only register to vote. As you know, registration to vote in the upcoming election ended October the 5th. But now that you are registered, are you going to get active and are you going to get out there? Not just for yourself, but encourage others. Whatever your position is, that you take advantage of the opportunity that we have because others fought, bled, and died for us to have this right. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU, and you are on the Real World, Real Talk podcast network. I want to thank all of you for being with us today as we are focusing on election 2020. Now, this show today is doing something a little different in that we're not discussing really politics from the perspective of a Democratic or a Republican perspective, but we're looking at some of the nonpartisan issues that we need to, I believe, think about as we are planning to exercise our right to vote. We earlier talked about election 2020 and looking at this election through the theological lens and examining race, faith, and politics. And how we as believers, we say we are Christians, but it's amazing how partisan politics have come in to divide us more than the Bible has divided us. And so that's been part of our conversation. But I want to shift now to a brother who has, he's just been thrown into the fire. I asked him earlier if he knew this was coming, and needless to say, he has done a tremendous job. Christopher Hollins became the third Harris County clerk in 3 years, appointed to the post after the incumbent Diane Troutman resigned after 17 months because of unspecified health concerns. He has assumed this role in the midst of the most challenging election seasons in the history of our country and county, including facing the difficult task of running primary, runoff, and November general elections during the novel coronavirus pandemic. The primary role of the county clerk's office is to maintain property and vital records, including the issuance of marriage licenses. But the clerk's most visible job is conducting elections. And this county clerk is committed to making sure all the residents of Harris County are able to vote safely, conveniently, and with the confidence that their vote is going to be counted. Man, join me in welcoming to Real World, Real Talk, Mr. Chris Hollins. County Clerk, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Dr. Cofield. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm grateful that I'm allowed to be here to share some of these messages about how to get folks out to vote this fall.
Yeah, it sounds like you're in the midst of setting up and getting ready. Talk about walking into this season of pandemic. Literally is just thrust upon you, and you've got to figure out, after the controversies around voting, both with your immediate predecessor and then the prior administration, there were some concerns about voting and accessibility to voting. Talk about what your approach has been as you have been forced to deal with COVID-19 and all of the ramifications of that.
Absolutely. Well, my job might not be simple, but it is straightforward. It's to protect the right to vote for every registered voter in Harris County, period. And as you mentioned a moment ago, especially since we're dealing with this deadly virus right now, we have to make sure that voters can cast their votes safely, but also to provide access to the polls, to make sure they can do so with convenience. And during a time of so much misinformation and drama around elections that frankly shouldn't be, we have to ensure that voters know that their votes are going to be counted and that they're going to have their seat at the table on election day, especially here in Harris County.
The Texas Supreme Court ruled that you were not allowed to send out mail-in ballots. You wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to be able to vote. It seems like the powers that be want to make it as difficult and as challenging to vote. Where are you in that process now, and what are you saying to those of us who are Harris County residents regarding exercising our right to vote?
So despite the Supreme Court siding with vote suppressors, as well as the governor and the attorney general doing the same, and so many others out there who don't want you to exercise your right to vote and do so safely right now, this is going to be, right here in Harris County, the most accessible and safe election in the history of Texas, bar none. That is the guiding light of our office. We are going to give you more ways to vote, more days to vote, more places to vote, more hours to vote than ever before. And these powers that be, these partisan political forces, can't stop us, because this is not about any kind of Democrat or Republican thing. This is making sure that every voter in Harris County has access to the polls, is able to exercise your constitutional right to the franchise, and especially as our ancestors have fought so difficult to secure this right for us.
Yeah. One of the concerns was, and there was a change made by Mrs. Trotman to allow voters to vote anywhere. They were not restricted to specific precincts anymore. Will you continue that process? And then secondly, there was a concern that there were more places to vote in what had historically been Republican areas as opposed to Democratic areas. Will you balance that off as well?
Yeah. So, Harris County owes Dr. Troutman a debt of gratitude for making voting simpler, in that there's no confusion about where you can vote, because you can vote anywhere. But there are some things that we need to do to continue to increase voter access. What's stuck in a lot of people's minds is March 3rd, 2020, a line at TSU going until 1 a.m. And we had to work to change issues like that, increase the number of machines that are out there in the system, allocate those machines better to be more appropriate to the traffic that's coming to certain areas like TSU, making sure that there are more locations and more options for people to cast their ballots. And we've done just that. If you compare November of 2020 to November of 2016, we have tripled the number of early voting centers across Harris County. And again, you asked a question about Republican areas and Democratic areas. We want every registered voter in Harris County to have an opportunity to vote conveniently, to do so at a place that's near your house, on your public transit line, near your church, near your child's school. And we're delivering on that. And in addition to having this record number of early voting centers, we're doing even more on election day. We're going to have over 800 locations on election day, which is certainly more than have been in any jurisdiction in Texas in history.
Wow. Well, that's great news. Lastly, I know you got to go, but you have initiated a program where you have pre-recorded statements to encourage people to get out and vote. They're nonpartisan statements. You are asking churches and groups to play those on their streaming platforms and on their social media platforms. Talk about that initiative and why that's so important to you.
Well, it's just about getting information out to voters. People see on social media and in the news so many confusing messages, and they have valid questions about, do I have a right to do this? Or will my vote be counted if I cast it in this way? And we want to make sure that people know the truth from the folks who are administering your election. And so the truth is, again, you have 120 places you can cast your vote during early voting. 10 of those are drive-through locations. Any voter can go and cast their ballot from the convenience of their vehicles for safety and for convenience during this time. During the last week of early voting, we're going to offer extended hours till 10 p.m. On Thursday, October 29th, we're offering 24-hour voting at 7 locations across Harris County. And this is all new. And so people need to hear these messages. And so we're grateful to churches like Good Hope and so many other houses of worship that are sharing these messages with your congregations, so that people know their rights, know the ways that they can vote, and make sure that they ultimately make a plan to vote and cast those votes this November.
Wow. I'll tell you what, that's great information, and we really appreciate your commitment to empowering voters and making voting more accessible to people. It's amazing to me how we have many times historically treated voting like it was a 9-to-5 job, not allowing for people who may work off hours or work more than one job. So we really appreciate you taking that opportunity and using your position to be able to make voting more accessible. Clerk Chris Hollins, thank you so much for being with us today, man, on Real World Real Talk. I appreciate you. If there's any way we can help serve you while you're in office or even after, man, we really thank you. All right?
Thanks again for having me. And make sure you get to the polls.
Yes, sir. Thank you, man. Well, I tell you what, the late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And this fight for the right to vote, not just to have the right, but to exercise the right, is something that is pivotal. And even more importantly than that, it is necessary for us to see what we desire to come to pass out of this upcoming election. We have a clear choice, I believe, in terms of what direction we want this country to go in. And it's up to us now to go out and vote. It's not enough to just register. Your registering to vote ended October the 5th. Now you've got to exercise the right. And so we want to encourage you to do that. You heard our county clerk. Man, I'm excited. I tell you what, 24-hour voting centers available around the county. That's tremendous, man. I mean, think about that. 24-hour polling centers where you can go and vote. And your ability to vote is not going to be limited to where you live. You can vote where you work. You can vote where you hang out, wherever there's a polling center, which means what? There's no excuse not to vote. So make sure you get out and exercise your right. All right. Until next time, this is Dr. DZ Cofield with Real World Real Talk signing off. Make sure you do your part to make the world a better place and be part of the solution and not just sitting on the sidelines complaining about what's not happening. Bye-bye. Peace.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real, and stay real.